In Lab 11, we are going to cover axial musculature. And what that means is we'll be looking at muscles of the head and neck in part 1, and then in part 2, we'll be looking at the torso, mainly the superficial back and then the abdominal region. These do correspond to lab manual exercises 11 and 12, so make sure you're keeping up with those in your manual. That is all good information to know. There's some really helpful tables in your lab manual as well for muscles. Before we jump in, I do want to talk about some kind of fast and easy ways to study muscles and what you don't want to do. So the first thing I will tell you is look for patterns. There are so many muscles in the body that you are expected to know within the next couple of labs that it's just not efficient to study them one at a time. So instead, we want to find patterns. We will look at different muscle compartments or muscle groups. These are going to be muscles that are kind of found within the same fascial compartment. And so we'll be looking at cross sections on Friday of different muscle compartments. And that's more relevant to the appendicular skeleton, but we'll still see examples of it with the axial skeleton. So things like that, things like common actions and attachments are going to be super helpful to know. For example, I think I've used the hamstring example in class, but all 3 hamstring muscles are going to attach at the ischial tuberosity. So rather than breaking it up and studying each muscle of the 3 one at a time, we can find those patterns to help identify things more quickly. Another thing you want to do is interact. And this could look like just getting really hands-on with the models in class, taking photos, potentially downloading these images from your modules of the muscle models. And then you can also practice actions on yourself. So it might look silly during a lab exam or a lecture exam, but if you are struggling to recall the action of a muscle, go ahead and try to contract that muscle on yourself and see which way the joints are moving. That's something I do all the time. I think it's really helpful, and that's just one way to help kind of jumpstart your brain if you're struggling on the lab exam. And we also want to look at multiple views. So this is kind of a disadvantage of looking at pictures or flashcards. We can't always get multiple views of the same muscles. So a lot of what we'll do in class is we're going to look at all different orientations of muscles. We'll practice that orientation when you get to a station and you have to figure out which view you're looking at. But you want to look at anterior, posterior, lateral, medial views, just so you're really comfortable with all of those views by the time we get to our lab exam too. And then the main don't of studying muscles is be careful with flashcards. So I'm not going to say flashcards are never a good idea, but you don't want to make flashcards for individual muscles, because then what you end up with is you have a ginormous pile of flashcards. You'll be flipping through them and recognizing muscles, but then it's really easy to get mixed up or forget muscles when you do that technique on a lab exam. So if you are going to do flashcards, I would recommend incorporating these first 3 points. Make flashcards for common muscle groups, make flashcards to list muscles with common actions, things like that. But don't make flashcards just for individual muscles, because that's a really good way to overwhelm yourself with information. So those are just my quick and easy tips for approaching the muscle system. And a lot of what we're going to do in this video is we're going to use those images from the modules and look at things like attachments and actions. I'm not going to go over every single one because not all of them are going to be helpful for identifying muscles on the lab exam. There's specific cases for different types of muscles. So most of what we're going to do is practice identifying from the kind of models you'll have on the lab exam. So we're going to start with some muscles of facial expression. So already this tells us that they're going to have similar actions. Anything from this anterior view is going to likely be a muscle of facial expression. So we're going to zoom in here. Okay. And I will be using that technique where we draw with along the orientation of the muscle fibers, because I just think that is super helpful for identifying muscle actions. So we're going to start with two of the weirdest muscles of the face, and these are going to be our orbicularis muscles. So this guy here, and then this muscle, both share the term orbicularis. And so we have one for the eye and one for the mouth. Orbicularis oculi is going to be associated with our eye. So we can think ocular. Hopefully we've all seen that term before if you go to the eye doctor. That is going to be a muscle that contracts our eyelids. If we compare that to our other orbicularis muscle, this one is associated with the mouth. So we're going to use the term oris, orbicularis oris. And so this one, because it's another kind of sphincter muscle, it's a ring of muscle around the mouth, it is going to help close and protrude our lips. So if we think about the direction of contraction here, they're going to be closing things, closing the eyelid, closing the lips. Okay. Another muscle we can see is the buccinator. And so we have seen the term buccal before, referring to cheek. So if we had to guess, this muscle is going to be compressing the cheeks. And we can see that guy, if we get some of this out of the way, buccinator is going to be running kind of laterally on the cheek. And so it is a little difficult to see in this view. We'll see it again from a lateral view. Come back. It's going to be running laterally along our cheek so that when it compresses or when it contracts, it's going to help us compress our cheek. Some other things we can see are our zygomaticus muscles. And so a big cue for zygomaticus is zygo means twin. So these are going to be kind of twin pairs of muscle. And what they are doing is they are actually attached to the corners of our mouth. So when you're trying to identify these, you want to get to the corner of the mouth, either side, and we're looking for a paired muscle that's kind of running laterally. And another term we have heard before is the zygomatic arch. So we're trying to create those associations to help us identify this muscle. Zygomatic arch is going to be our cheekbone, which is at this level here. So if we try to connect the dots here and see which muscles are running kind of superolaterally, it's going to be this guy and this guy. Okay, so these are going to be our zygomaticus major and minor. Now that's another clue. We have a major and a minor muscle. The major muscle is going to be a little bigger, and it's also more inferior. So this is our zygomaticus major. Zygomaticus minor is going to be a little more superior. So those are just ways to practice identifying them. We have a lot of clues from the name already. Okay, so we have a couple more muscles associated with the cranium. Let me get some of this text out of the way. And those are going to be our frontalis and occipitalis. Now, we've heard these terms for cranial bones before. Frontal bone is going to be most anterior. So our frontalis muscle is this muscle here, running kind of superior-inferiorly. Look at the direction of the fibers here. And if we had to guess based on the direction of those fibers and what would happen if the fibers shortened, it makes sense that our frontalis muscle helps to raise the eyebrows. So up here we have our more secure attachment point. We would call this our origin. So when the muscle shortens with contraction, it's going to pull our eyebrow more superiorly. Lastly, we have our occipitalis. So let's see if we can get a different view here. So this muscle, it is not very well defined here, but occipitalis is associated with our occipital bone. So it's kind of covered here by this term called an aponeurosis that we'll talk about. But this is a level where we'd expect to find our occipitalis. And this is actually going to help draw our scalp posteriorly. So towards the more stable attachment at the base of the neck. So with that one, we can see a little bit of it from this view. It's a small muscle. you're not likely to see it on the lab exam because it's not well defined. So things like frontalis or the facial muscles are more likely because we can very clearly tell them apart from the rest of the model. There is a muscle called the platysma. We don't have it on our model, so don't worry about that one for the exam. We have a couple more muscles of facial expression here, so we're going to move further down the face now. We have our mentalis. Mentalis refers to the chin. So this is going to be our mental region inferiorly. And then the mentalis, it's cut off here, but it has two kind of prongs of muscle that are going to unite to form that muscle that helps us to protrude our lower lip. So they're attached from the mental region to our lower lip. So an example of this action would be pouting. When you protrude your lip, you create that pout expression. So that's going to be mentalis. Let's see if our other model has, yeah, probably not. So, and this is another case where our example is cut off here. It's maybe not a great candidate for a lab exam. Two more muscles we have that are associated with the lips are going to be our depressor labii inferioris and our levator labii superioris. So we get a lot of information from the name here. The first term is going to be the action, so depressor or levator. Term 2 refers to the region, labii, referring to the lip. And then last one is going to be directional. Is it superior or inferior? And we're going to see the term levator a lot. That just refers to elevation. So we'll see it with the scapula too. That is an action called elevating. So from that name, we get 3 tidbits of information that are going to help us to identify it. So first one, we want to find our lip. I know it seems silly, but find your basics first. Find your lip. And then we're looking for muscles that are going to connect to our lip. Now these guys are a little tricky because a lot of the muscles surrounding the mouth run into each other. You can see our orbicularis oris here is kind of running into this little slip of muscle, this triangular part running like this. This muscle that I just outlined is going to be our depressor labii inferioris. So it is connected to the lip and the muscle surrounding the lip. It's inferior to our lip, and so when that muscle contracts, it's going to pull our lip inferiorly. Levator labii superioris is going to be a little harder to find. So this one is tricky because it actually runs up towards the nose. And this model is not super well defined here, but what we see is we've got this muscle. This region here is kind of a conjunction of a couple muscles, but the one closest to the nose here, I'm going to outline it again, that's coming down to connect to the lip, that's going to be our levator labii superioris. So on a lab exam, that one's not really fair to ask because it's not well defined. So I'd focus more on depressor labii inferioris towards the inferior part of the face. And then we have our muscles of chewing. So let's clear some space here. You're going to see this term mastication come up, and all that means is chewing. And we have a couple really powerful muscles associated with our jaw. So let's go ahead and write that term down. Make sure you know mastication refers to chewing. So the main muscles of mastication are going to be temporalis, our masseter, and then our digastric, which we will bookmark for now, but we're going to talk about when we get to the neck. So temporalis, let's think about what bone it might be associated with. We see temporal, so hopefully you're thinking temporal bone. If we scroll down here and look at a lateral view of the skull, we want to find that temporal region. So temporal bone is roughly in this area. We do see this nice fan-shaped muscle here, right above our ear. That's going to be our temporalis. So you can find your temporal bone first, orient yourself, and then the only muscle we see here is going to be that temporalis. Masseter is associated with the mandible, and this one is really thick. It's one of our most powerful chewing muscles. So one way that might help you remember that is you see M, think mandible. So we're going to be looking in that region for the masseter. And that is going to be this guy here, masseter. And one note here, we also can see our zygomaticus muscles from this view. So those guys that are running up towards the cheekbone. We have a nice view of them here. And then actually this muscle you see a little deeper, it's going to be buccinator. So kind of recalling some of those other muscles of facial expression. But from a lateral view, the most likely things you will see would be temporalis or the masseter. Okay, there are a couple more muscles. I'm going to mention them. I'm not going to bother to point them out on the model because they're just too deep for us to see. But we have two paired muscles called the medial pterygoid and lateral pterygoids. So these guys are associated with chewing. So, and their spelling on these it's tricky. So pterygoid, kind of like pterodactyl, pterygoid, and we're going to have a medial and a lateral pair. And they're going to help just raise the mandible, move it laterally. So that's something that might show up on a lab exam. Sorry, not on a lab exam, on a lecture, but I'm not going to ask you that for lab just because they're deeper and we can't see them very well on our model. And that is everything from the head. Next video, we're going to run through the neck, and then kind of the second half will be muscles of the torso.